We're going to hone in on this aspect of deductive arguments called validity, how validity works. So let's look at a definition. And I want to be clear, we're now homing in on deductive reasoning. So forget about the probability stuff for a minute, that's inductive. Let's focus in on certainty. And validity is only a feature of deductive arguments. So I don't want to hear anybody write or say, this was a valid argument if it's inductive. It does not apply to inductive reasoning. The way we evaluate inductive reasoning, as we'll talk about later, is based on strength or weakness. That's the only consideration. But with deductive arguments, the considerations are validity and soundness. So let's talk about those. So validity is a particular condition in which if you assume the premises to be true, the conclusion would follow with certainty. Now notice my use of if and would. This is what's called counterfactual reasoning, and this is what's so difficult for many students to see here, is that I'm saying if these things were true, whether or not they are actually true does not matter to validity. Validity, we merely assume that what the speaker has given to us in his argument or her argument is correct. We assume the truth of what's being given to us, even if it's ridiculous, because that will tell us if the logic they've presented even makes sense to begin with, if the logic is even valid. The next step, soundness, is where we start thinking about, is it actually true? But before we get there, to slow our thinking down, which is what we're doing in this class, we have to first assume that these premises given to us are true, even if we know they're not. And this is the tricky part. There's something counterintuitive here, seemingly counterintuitive, but it's actually very intuitive when you think through it and when you think slowly about it. We assume they're true, even if we don't know if they're true or if they're obviously false. In other words, we give the speaker the benefit of the doubt, and we say, okay, I'm going to assume what you gave me. You gave me a bunch of crap. I'm going to assume what you gave me makes sense, and I'm going to find the best example of your logic here. That's what it means to determine if an argument is valid or invalid. The conclusion cannot be false if the premises are assumed true. They cannot be false. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples. Let's say I said, first premise, all women get pregnant. Susanna is a woman, so Susanna will get pregnant. Now right away, if I asked you valid or invalid, some of you are going to say invalid and you'd be wrong. And the reason you're going to say invalid is because you're thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, all women do not get pregnant. Some women don't have kids, right? You're thinking the first premise didn't make sense. But you would have misunderstood what I just said before. What I just said before was that even if the premise doesn't make sense in content, we assume for the sake of the argument that it's true. So even though I know that the first premise is false, I still assume that it's true. So believe it or not, this is actually a valid argument. Because if it were true, remember I said counterfactual, thinking about what would have happened, what may have happened if something else was the case. If this were true, then that's the way we're thinking right now. If it were true that all women get pregnant, we know it's not, but if it were, we're assuming it's true for the sake of the logic. If it were true that all women get pregnant and Susanna is a woman, then it would have to also be true that Susanna will get pregnant, right? Notice that in a sense, the conclusion is already entailed by the premises. You almost don't even have to state it. It's almost part of the logic that came before, and that's a feature of deductive reasoning, is that deductive reasoning, it already contains the truth within the premises, and the conclusion sort of gets pushed out automatically. If you can imagine as a machine just pushing out conclusions, it gets pushed out automatically, whereas in an inductive argument, it doesn't get pushed out, it points to different directions that might be the case. But with a deductive argument, the truth of the conclusion is contained within the premises in a sense. So that would be a valid argument, even though the first premise is false. Right? So Again, you've got to understand the difference between assumed truth and actual truth to really get this material. Now, yeah, actually, let me, you know what? Let me talk while I'm doing this. I'm gonna add in the part about soundness to put it all in one. So, one more time, to have a valid argument, it's about form. If the premises are assumed to be true, then the conclusion must be true also. It cannot be false if the premises are assumed to be true. Soundness, though, is about whether the premises are actually true. So when we evaluate a deductive argument, we first figure out, does the form make sense? If I assume the premise is true, would the conclusion follow? We figure that out first. If we find that the argument is valid, that the conclusion would be true, has to be true if the premises are, then we've completed task number one, and now we move on to task number two, which is the logic sound? Does the logic make sense? Are the claims true? So, in other words, the analysis for the argument I just gave you about women getting pregnant would be, it's a valid but unsound argument. It's valid because the form of the logic makes sense, but it's not sound because the premises are not actually true. So in other words, it's a bad argument. It's an argument with good form because it's valid, but bad meaning because the content isn't true. Right? So now we're done evaluating the argument. Now, notice that I hope you're a little happier now, because when I first said, well, this is a valid argument, some of you were like, well, how could a good label apply to something that is clearly wrong? And the answer is that to think slowly, you've got to distinguish between different categories. And we're distinguishing between the category of form and content. And yes, it was wrong in content, but it was good in form. And it's important to be able to recognize that difference to be able to reason well, which is a major goal of this class.